Imagine being trapped in a tiny wooden lighthouse, battered by storms miles from shore, and forced to live beside the corpse of your only companion. In 1801, off the coast of Wales, 2 lighthouse keepers were assigned to the remote Smalls Rock. What should have been a routine watch turned into one of the most harrowing survival stories ever told. Storms raged, food dwindled, and when tragedy struck, one man was left to endure the unimaginable, completely alone, yet surrounded by death. This is the true story of the Smalls Lighthouse keepers, the ordeal that changed maritime history forever. The sea has always demanded guardians. Long before satellites, radios and steel ships, mariners navigated by stars, instinct and the dim promise of light on the horizon. Those lights were kept alive not by machines but by men, lonely, stubborn men, who endured storms, hunger and silence to make sure ships found their way home. Off the coast of Pembrokeshire, Wales, there lies a stretch of jagged rocks in the Celtic Sea known as the Smalls. Barely visible at high tide, these treacherous points had wrecked countless ships before one man, Henry Whiteside, a Liverpool musical instrument maker turned amateur engineer, designed a wooden lighthouse to stand upon them. It was built in 1776. A marvel for its time, tall wooden piles driven into the reef, forming a spindly tower against the endless expanse of ocean. It looked fragile, yet it stood. But life inside it, that was another matter. The Smalls Lighthouse was the loneliest posting in Britain. Isolated far from the mainland, supplies came only when the weather allowed, which might mean weeks of nothing but salted meat, hard biscuits and barrels of water, if the sea permitted. When storms raged, the men inside felt the tower sway, the timbers groan, the floorboards tremble with each impact of waves crashing dozens of feet below. There was no escape. For safety, the Trinity House authorities, responsible for managing lighthouses, required that 2 men be stationed at Smalls at all times. The idea was simple: companionship, shared responsibility, and in the event of illness, one could care for the other. But in truth, being trapped for months in a tiny wooden chamber with another soul was as much a curse as it was protection. The men couldn't leave, couldn't stretch their legs beyond a few planks outside, couldn't find privacy. Small disagreements became amplified. Snoring, a careless word, a different way of preparing food. Little irritations grew like mould in the damp air. And so, in the year 1801, 2 men found themselves bound to this assignment. One was Thomas Howell, a carpenter by trade, strong, practical and accustomed to hard work. Rough around the edges, he had the blunt manner of someone used to tools more than words. He wasn't unkind, but he was no diplomat. The other was Thomas Griffith, younger, reportedly less seasoned, more prone to complaint, and according to some accounts, not a man Howell much cared for. The two had little affection between them, but rules were rules. 2 keepers, 1 tower, endless weeks of isolation. When they first arrived, the sea was calm. Spring had been generous, and though supplies were meagre, the lighthouse stood firm. At night, they climbed the narrow stairs to tend the oil lamps, trimming the wicks, polishing the reflectors, making sure the light burned steady to warn sailors of the lurking rocks below. By day, they repaired what the sea destroyed, patching leaks, replacing planks, reinforcing bolts rusted by salt spray. It was routine, monotonous, and yet laced with a tension neither man voiced aloud. The sea was always watching, always waiting, and then, as summer faded into autumn, the storms came. The Black Sea gale of 1854 would one day be remembered for wrecking fleets. But long before that, storms had already earned a reputation here in the Celtic waters. These tempests were unpredictable, violent and relentless. In October 1801, such a storm struck the Smalls, one of the worst in years. For days, the men could not open the shutters without spray drenching the chamber. The waves rose so high that they struck the platform itself, shaking the structure like a reed. Provisions that had been carefully rationed began to dwindle. Supply boats, of course, could not reach them. It was during this storm that fate began to turn. Griffith fell ill. Whether it was from bad food, exhaustion, or an accident remains uncertain. Some say he injured himself during maintenance, others that fever simply overtook him. Whatever the cause, Howell watched as his fellow keeper weakened, coughing, groaning, unable to climb the stairs, unable to tend the light. Howell, with grim determination, took over both duties, feeding the fire, hauling the oil, keeping watch, all while trying to care for a man who only grew worse with each passing day. The sea raged outside. Inside, so did despair. The storm did not relent. For days, the men inside the Smalls Lighthouse could do nothing but endure. The tower shook as waves hammered against its stilts. Wind shrieked through cracks in the wood. The endless noise made sleep almost impossible. Inside the lantern room, the light sputtered as Howell fought to keep it alive against gusts that threatened to blow it out. And all the while, Thomas Griffith lay on his cot, growing weaker. At first, Howell believed it was nothing more than exhaustion. A fever, perhaps, or a passing illness brought on by damp air and unspoiled rations. He made simple remedies: warm water, bits of food softened in broth, cloths soaked in cool seawater to place across Griffith's burning forehead. But the illness deepened. Griffith moaned through the night, his body shaking with chills. Then came silence, the kind that was far worse than noise. He grew still, too still. His breathing grew ragged, shallow. Howell knew he was losing him. There were no doctors here, no medicine, no priest, no chance of relief. The sea kept them prisoners, and the storm's fury mocked their isolation. Howell was alone with a man he did not like, a man he had quarrelled with over chores, over food, over words spoken too sharply. And yet now, in this frail body before him, he saw not an enemy, but the fragility of all men against the sea. Griffith died. The moment itself was quiet, a final breath, a shudder, and then stillness. Howell sat in silence for a long while, staring at the pale face of the man who had shared this prison with him. The storm outside seemed to swell, as though nature itself marked the passing with one last roar. But in that silence came a new terror, one Howell could never have prepared for. What was he to do with the body? On land, there would be burial, a church, family to mourn. Here, on the Smalls, there was nothing but sea and stone. To throw the body into the waves felt like desecration. Worse still, Howell feared what people on the mainland might say. In a time of superstition and suspicion, if he returned alone, how could he prove that Griffith had died of illness? What if they accused him of murder? After all, the two men had never gotten along. The thought gnawed at him until it became unbearable. He could not risk it. He had to keep the body. So Howell did what instinct and desperation demanded. He fashioned a crude coffin from spare planks, hammering together a wooden box inside the lighthouse. But the coffin was too large for the cramped quarters, and the smell of decay in such damp air would be unbearable. Instead, he dragged it outside. There, on the narrow platform of the lighthouse, with waves crashing below and wind tearing at his clothes, he secured the coffin to the railing with ropes. The box swayed and groaned with every blast of wind, banging against the lighthouse timbers, as though the dead man within still demanded to be heard. The noise was maddening. Day and night, Howell heard the coffin creak, scrape and knock, a constant reminder of the companion he had lost but could not bury. And then, the storm grew worse. One night, a fierce gust ripped at the coffin, breaking its lid. Howell, rushing outside, saw in horror that Griffith's arm had slipped free. The stiff, pale limb jutted into the night, waving grotesquely in the wind as if signalling for help. Howell tied it back, but the ropes frayed, and again, the arm broke loose, swinging in the gale like a ghastly signal flag. From the mainland, fishermen later reported seeing the lighthouse in the distance during the storm. They swore they saw a figure waving from the tower, and they assumed all was well. In truth, it was the dead keeper's arm, flailing in the wind, while Howell endured his solitude inside, teetering on the edge of madness. Weeks passed. Howell could not escape the sight, the sound, the stench. Every creak of the coffin outside echoed in his skull. The smell of decay seeped through the cracks of the lighthouse, clinging to his clothes, his skin, his hair. He ate little. He slept less. Each day, he climbed the stairs to tend the light, his only salvation, the duty that gave him reason not to collapse entirely. But each night he was reminded he was trapped with death itself, and the sea would not let him go. The loneliness became unbearable. He spoke aloud, sometimes to himself, sometimes to Griffith, as though the man were still alive. He cursed the storm, cursed Trinity House, cursed the ocean that had imprisoned him. The days blurred together until Howell no longer knew how long he had been alone. Hope, if it existed, was a faint light on the horizon, a supply ship that might never come, and still, the coffin knocked and the dead man waved. By the spring of 1801, the brutal winter storms that had imprisoned Thomas Howell inside the Smalls Lighthouse finally began to give way. The gales that had battered the wooden structure for months softened into calmer winds, and the ice-choked seas loosened their grip. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, boats from the Pembrokeshire coast dared to set out toward the lonely outpost. On the mainland, rumours about the keepers had been growing. Families, merchants and fishermen who relied on the lighthouse whispered about its silence. No messages had arrived in weeks, and the isolation of the place left everyone uneasy. The owners of the Smalls Lighthouse Company, anxious about their investment and the safety of their men, finally ordered a relief boat to sail. But those tasked with the journey knew the risks. The Smalls Rock sat in one of the most treacherous patches of water in the British Isles, where sudden squalls could swallow ships whole. When the relief vessel finally crested the horizon, Howell spotted it from the lantern gallery. At first he doubted his own eyes. So many weeks of solitude, of fear and exhaustion had played tricks on his mind. But as the ship drew closer, the truth was undeniable. Help was coming. The boat anchored as near as safety would allow, its crew watching the swells with caution. From their deck, they peered up at the wooden tower. Instead of two men waving in welcome, only one figure appeared, gaunt, ragged and pale. Thomas Howell raised his arm in a shaky salute. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His beard was long and unkempt, and his eyes were hollow from months of grief and solitude. The crew shouted across the waves, asking about his partner. Howell's reply, carried by the wind, was grim and broken. Buried at sea, months gone. When they finally boarded the lighthouse, the stench of decay still lingered. Howell, desperate to protect himself from madness, had dragged the body of his fellow keeper, Thomas Griffith, into a makeshift coffin he had crafted from spare planks. Unable to dispose of it in the stormy seas, without risk of being accused of foul play, he had lashed it outside to the gallery, where the winds and salt had slowly stripped it down. The sight horrified the rescuers, yet it also explained Howell's haunted appearance. For months, he had lived not only with grief, but with the constant reminder of death. Suspended just beyond his window, the rescuers helped Howell gather what little he could carry. His hands shook as he touched the walls of the tower one last time, as though unsure if he was leaving behind a tomb or a prison. The lantern above still shone, though its glass was streaked with salt and soot. Despite everything, Howell had kept it burning. That small flame had guided sailors safely through the winter, even as it consumed the last reserves of his strength. As they pulled away from the Smalls, Howell collapsed onto the deck of the relief boat. He stared at the sea, silent as though words had abandoned him. Only when the faint outline of the Welsh coast appeared did he finally break down, tears spilling freely. Months of fear, loneliness and unimaginable endurance poured out of him at once. His return to land was met with astonishment. People scarcely believed that one man could have survived so long in such conditions. Howell's ordeal became a story retold in taverns, on docks, and in drawing rooms across Wales. But beneath the fascination lay an uncomfortable truth. The system had failed him. The lighthouse keepers had been left too long, too isolated, with too little support. Howell's survival was not a triumph of planning, but of sheer human will. In time, his story would spur change. The tragedy of Griffith's death and Howell's descent into near madness became the catalyst for reform in how lighthouse duties were manned. Never again would keepers be stationed in such extreme isolation without relief. The Smalls disaster showed the world that the guardians of the sea's safety needed protection themselves. For Howell, though, the scars never fully healed. He rarely spoke of those months, and when pressed, his answers were brief and quiet. What he endured on that rock, the storms, the death of his comrade, and the long silence of the sea remained locked in his memory, too heavy to share. Yet every sailor who passed the Smalls afterward, guided by a brighter, better managed light, owed something to the man who had held out against despair in the loneliest corner of the Irish Sea. The story of Thomas Howell's survival and Thomas Griffith's tragic death did not fade quietly into history. In fact, it grew into one of the most influential cautionary tales in maritime safety. The Smalls Lighthouse ordeal was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a turning point that reshaped the way lighthouses were manned across Britain and beyond. When Howell returned home, the details of what had happened on that lonely rock quickly spread across Pembrokeshire. Sailors whispered it in harbours, merchants recounted it in marketplaces, and newspaper editors, ever hungry for sensational stories, seized upon it. The image of a man locked inside a wooden tower for months, forced to live beside the decomposing body of his partner, horrified the public. For mariners, the story struck even deeper. If the guardians of the sea's lights could be so neglected, what hope was there for those who relied upon them? Pressure mounted on the Smalls Lighthouse Company, and eventually on Trinity House, the organisation responsible for lighthouses across Britain. Critics argued that no man should ever again be subjected to such extreme solitude and danger. The very purpose of a lighthouse was to protect life at sea, and yet the men who kept them were being sacrificed to loneliness, grief and madness. From this outcry came one of the most enduring reforms in lighthouse keeping, the decision that no lighthouse would ever again be manned by fewer than 3 keepers, with 3 men stationed. If one were to die, fall ill, or become incapacitated, the others could manage the light and provide mutual support. It was a small change on paper, but a monumental shift in practice, an acknowledgement that the keepers themselves were as vital to maritime safety as the beacons they maintained. The Smalls disaster also reshaped the way relief schedules were planned. Instead of leaving men stranded for months with uncertain rescue, authorities introduced stricter timetables for resupply and rotation. This not only ensured the well-being of keepers, but also guaranteed the reliability of the lights. A weakened or desperate man might falter in his duties. A healthy and supported keeper would not. The reforms rippled outward. In time, lighthouse boards in other countries studied the Smalls case, using it as evidence for changes in their own systems. Across Europe and even as far as America, maritime authorities acknowledged that isolation could be as deadly as storm or fire. The Smalls story became part of the global conversation about maritime safety. For Howell himself, these reforms were cold comfort. He carried the trauma with him for the rest of his life. Those who knew him remarked that his once lively demeanour had been dulled. He worked again, but never with the same spirit. His silence on the ordeal was telling. He had endured it, but he could not relive it. Yet even in his silence, his endurance left a legacy. Every keeper who followed, every man who stood a night watch with 2 companions at his side, owed something to Howell's lonely struggle. His suffering had sparked a system that made lighthouse life more humane and more secure. The Smalls Lighthouse itself changed too. The wooden structure that had swayed and groaned under storms was eventually replaced by a sturdier stone tower in 1861, a monument to engineering resilience. Mariners passing through the Irish Sea saw in its light not just a warning of rocks, but also a reminder of the cost paid to make that light shine. And so the tale of Smalls Rock lived on, not merely as a maritime ghost story, but as a pivotal chapter in the history of seafaring. The waves of the Irish Sea had tested the strength of 2 men, and though one was lost, the ordeal they endured together reshaped the lives of countless others who would follow. The Smalls Lighthouse stood for decades more, its beams sweeping across the restless waters of the Irish Sea. But long after its wooden frame was replaced with stone, and long after its oil lamps gave way to electric light, the story of Howell and Griffith continued to linger in maritime memory. For sailors, it was a reminder that the dangers of the sea were not limited to storms and reefs. Isolation, too, could be as deadly as a gale. For lighthouse authorities, it was a hard-earned lesson in responsibility. Never again would a keeper be abandoned to solitude without support, and for ordinary people, the tale spoke to something deeper, the endurance of a man tested to his absolute limit and the price of survival. Thomas Howell never became a hero in the traditional sense. There were no parades, no medals pinned to his chest. His survival was quieter, marked not by triumph, but by a kind of haunted resilience. Yet history has a way of elevating such figures. He was not remembered for his silence, but for what that silence represented. A man who endured the unendurable so others might never have to. Generations later, the reforms born from Smalls would echo in distant corners of the world. Lighthouse keepers in America, Scandinavia and beyond would work in teams, sharing the burden and the companionship that Howell had been denied. In this way, his ordeal became part of a global safety net woven invisibly into the lives of men who would never know his name, but would benefit from his suffering, even now. In an age when satellites, GPS and automated beacons have replaced human keepers, the story of Smalls endures. It reminds us that progress is often written not in grand victories, but in the quiet endurance of ordinary people. Howell's long vigil, spent in the shadow of death, gave light to countless others. The sea remains as restless as ever, its storms as merciless, its horizons as lonely. But thanks to the lessons of Smalls, humanity learned to temper isolation with solidarity, to pair duty with compassion. Out of one man's silent suffering rose a beacon, not just of safety, but of change. And so, when the waves crash against the rocks of Smalls and the lighthouse still stands guard, it does more than warn of danger. It carries with it a memory, a story of endurance, of loss, and of how even in the darkest loneliness, a light can still shine. Few stories capture the raw extremes of human endurance like that of the Smalls Lighthouse. From isolation to survival, it stands as a reminder of how fragile and how strong the human spirit can be. If you found this story as haunting and fascinating as I did, join me in the next video where we uncover another extraordinary moment from history that will leave you thinking long after the screen goes dark. Until then, stay curious and keep the light burning.